The person who left isn't living in certainty. They're living in stages you've never seen. After a breakup, most people focus on their own pain. They analyze what went wrong, replay the final conversation, search for signs they missed. But there's another experience unfolding in parallel, one that remains invisible. What's happening inside the mind of the person who walked away. Not what they said when they left. What they're feeling now, weeks later, months later. When the initial relief fades and the psychological dynamics they thought they escaped start surfacing in unexpected ways. Understanding this isn't about control. It's not about manipulation or strategy. It's about behavior analysis, the kind that examines patterns, not isolated moments. Because the dumper's emotional behavior after a breakup follows a trajectory, it's not random. It's not unpredictable, and it's almost never what the person who was left imagines it to be. What looks like indifference from the outside is often confusion playing out in private. What feels like cruelty is usually just emotional withdrawal, while they try to make sense of a decision that felt necessary in the moment, but starts feeling incomplete over time. Relationship psychology doesn't end when the relationship does. It just shifts form. The attachment patterns that held two people together don't disappear the second someone says it's over. They linger. They adapt. They influence behavior long after contact has stopped. And for the dumper, those patterns create a specific internal experience, one that moves through relief, then guilt, then doubt, then something closer to regret. Though most of them will never call it that. They won't reach out and explain. They won't apologize or admit uncertainty. But their behavior will reveal it, if you know what to look for. This isn't about waiting for someone to come back. It's about understanding the psychological process that happens when someone leaves. Not to romanticize it, not to justify it, but to see it clearly, the way an investigator would examine evidence without emotional interference. Because the truth is, the person who walked away is also processing the breakup. They're also questioning whether they made the right choice. They're also watching from a distance, gathering information, testing possibilities, and slowly realizing that emotional distance doesn't always bring the clarity they thought it would. And by the time they figure that out, the person they left has often already moved on. After someone walks away, the mind doesn't rest. It doesn't move forward cleanly. Instead, it circles one question, again and again, in different forms, at different hours. Not why did they leave? That's already been said, sometimes too many times. The real question lives underneath. What are they feeling right now? It's not curiosity. It's something closer to psychological necessity. The need to know whether the person who caused the collapse is collapsing too, or if they've simply moved on without looking back. That absence of information becomes unbearable. The other person's silence creates a vacuum, and the human mind does not tolerate empty space. It fills it with assumptions, with narratives, with invented emotions that may or may not exist on the other side. This is where relationship psychology becomes less about the relationship itself and more about what happens when one half of the emotional structure disappears. The person left behind begins reading behavior from a distance. Social media activity, mutual friends, timing of responses that never come. Every piece of data gets analyzed. Emotional behavior doesn't stop when contact does. It just becomes indirect. What's rarely understood is that this question, what are they feeling, is not about them. It's about trying to stabilize an internal experience that no longer makes sense. The attachment patterns that once provided certainty are now feeding confusion. Distance doesn't clarify, it distorts. And the longer the silence lasts, the more the psychological dynamics shift from grief into something else. The need to interpret, to solve, to understand a person who is no longer available for understanding. The question doesn't get answered because the one who could answer it has already left the room. But here's what most people miss. The person who walked away isn't living in certainty either. They're not untouched. They're just operating inside a different emotional framework, one that doesn't show itself clearly from the outside. And that framework has its own stages. A breakup is not a single moment. It's not the conversation, the text, or the final sentence that ends it. Those are just the visible markers of something that's been unfolding beneath the surface for weeks, sometimes months. What people call the breakup is actually the collapse of an emotional routine that both individuals had been maintaining, consciously or not. It's the end of a behavioral loop, daily contact, shared plans, predictable emotional exchanges. When that structure disappears, both people enter a period of instability. But they don't enter it together. They enter it separately, for completely different reasons. The person who was left is trying to restore what was lost. The person who left is trying to validate what they just did. These are opposing psychological tasks, and they create opposing emotional behaviors. One is reaching backward, the other is moving forward, or at least attempting to. This difference in direction is what makes the post-breakup phase so disorienting. There's no shared experience anymore. There's no mutual understanding of what's happening. Each person is processing the same event through entirely different psychological dynamics, and neither one has access to what the other is actually feeling. This is where behavior analysis becomes essential. Words stop mattering. What someone says they feel and what their actions reveal are often misaligned, especially in the first weeks after a breakup. The dumper might say they're fine. They might even believe it. But emotional withdrawal doesn't mean emotional resolution. It just means the internal conflict has shifted locations. It's no longer between two people. It's now inside one person, playing out in private, where no one else can see it. And that private experience, the one happening inside the person who left, follows a pattern. It doesn't unfold randomly. It moves through stages, and each stage leaves behavioral evidence behind. The first thing the dumper feels is relief, not happiness. Not freedom in the expansive sense. Just relief. The internal tension that had been building, sometimes for weeks, sometimes quietly for months, is finally gone. The decision has been made. The conversation is over. There's no more weighing options, no more wondering if staying is the right move, no more guilt about thinking of leaving. That specific emotional weight disappears almost immediately. And for a short window of time, the dumper mistakes that absence of weight for clarity. This phase doesn't look like sadness from the outside. It looks like calm, maybe even confidence. The dumper might seem unusually functional, stable, even cold. But that's not cruelty. It's the nervous system resetting after prolonged emotional conflict. The breakup didn't create chaos for them. It ended it. What was chaotic was the time before, when they were still inside the relationship, but emotionally checked out. The actual separation brings a kind of order back. They believe, in this moment, that control has been restored. That they've done the hard thing, the necessary thing, and now life can move forward. But relief is not a stable emotional state. It's a temporary one. It exists only because the consequences haven't fully materialized yet. The dumper is still operating on the logic that justified the breakup in the first place. They're not yet facing what comes after. And what comes after is not what they expect. The relief doesn't last because the mind doesn't stay still. It starts observing. It starts measuring. And eventually, it starts questioning whether the thing that felt so clear in the moment of leaving still feels clear now. That's when the second layer appears. And it doesn't feel like relief anymore. Guilt doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, days or weeks after the breakup, once the initial relief begins to wear off. The dumper starts noticing things. How the other person reacted. How they're behaving now. Whether they're reaching out. Whether they've gone silent. Whether they seem destroyed or surprisingly okay. All of this becomes data. And that data triggers something the dumper wasn't prepared for. The realization that they caused pain. Not abstractly. Not theoretically. Actually caused it. To a real person. Someone they once cared about. This guilt is not the same as regret. Regret questions the decision itself. Guilt accepts the decision, but struggles with the aftermath. The dumper may still believe the breakup was necessary, but that belief doesn't erase the discomfort of watching someone else suffer because of it. Silent guilt emerges, and it doesn't create warmth. It creates distance. The dumper begins to avoid reminders of the person they left. They mute stories, unfollow mutuals, stop checking in. Not because they don't care, but because caring makes the guilt worse. Here's where attachment patterns and emotional behavior intersect in a way most people misread. The abandoned partner often believes that staying visible, staying emotionally present, will remind the dumper of what they lost. But visibility doesn't trigger longing. It triggers guilt. And guilt, when it becomes too uncomfortable, pushes the dumper further away. The more pain the ex displays, the more justified the distance feels. The dumper begins constructing a psychological narrative. I had to leave. Look how much they needed me. I couldn't carry that. The breakup stops being a choice and starts becoming a necessity in hindsight. The ex's behavior directly shapes how long this phase lasts. And most people, without realizing it, feed the very narrative that keeps the dumper away. Begging does not create desire. It confirms distance. When someone pleads, when they send long messages explaining why the relationship should continue, when they cry or apologize or promise to change, they believe they're showing love. But the dumper doesn't interpret it as love. They interpret it as evidence. Evidence that leaving was correct. Evidence that the dynamic they were trying to escape is still active. Evidence that the other person hasn't moved, hasn't processed, hasn't let go. Emotional excess doesn't attract. It validates an internal narrative the dumper has already constructed. That narrative usually sounds like this. They were too dependent. I felt suffocated. I needed space, and they couldn't give it to me. Every desperate message, every attempt to re-establish contact, every visible breakdown strengthens that story. The dumper doesn't feel pulled back. They feel justified. Psychological distance becomes not just acceptable, it becomes necessary. The relationship dynamics that led to the breakup are now being reinforced in the aftermath. This is one of the most misunderstood elements of post-breakup behavior. The person who was left believes that silence equals indifference, that absence means they'll be forgotten. So they reach out. They try to stay present. They try to remind the dumper of what was good. But the dumper already knows what was good. That's not what they're questioning. What they're questioning is whether staying was sustainable. And when the ex behaves in ways that mirror the emotional patterns that made the relationship feel heavy, the answer becomes clear. It wasn't. The breakup in the dumper's mind shifts from a painful decision to a necessary one. And once that shift happens, reconciliation becomes almost impossible, not because of cruelty, but because of psychological confirmation. The behavior they're seeing now is the same behavior that made them want to leave in the first place. Freedom, when it finally arrives, doesn't come with instructions. The dumper expected relief to stretch into something larger, clarity, peace, maybe even happiness. But what they get instead is confusion. Not the kind that makes them want to go back. The kind that makes them wonder what they're supposed to do now. The routines are gone. The predictable rhythms of the relationship no longer structure their days. And suddenly, all that open space feels less like freedom and more like uncertainty. This is when the dumper starts testing. They go out more. They accept invitations they used to decline. They engage with people they hadn't paid attention to before. New environments, new conversations, new stimuli. Everything becomes an emotional experiment. Not because they're trying to replace the ex, but because they're trying to figure out what they actually want, now that they're no longer tied to what they had. Relationship patterns that felt suffocating before are now absent, and the absence itself becomes disorienting. The dumper isn't looking for a new relationship, not immediately. They're looking for validation. Validation that they made the right choice. Validation that there's something better, or at least something different, out there. Validation that the life they imagined outside the relationship actually exists. And so they move, they engage, they explore. But none of it lands the way they thought it would. Every new experience is measured, consciously or not, against the one they left behind. And comparison is not freedom. It's another form of emotional behavior under examination. This phase looks like moving on from the outside. But internally, it's something closer to searching. The dumper is gathering evidence, not conclusions. And the evidence doesn't always point in the direction they expected. Rebounds are not about replacement, they're about measurement. The dumper meets someone new, maybe at a party, maybe through friends, maybe on an app. There's attraction, maybe even chemistry. But the connection doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in comparison. Every conversation, every touch, every moment of attention is being weighed against what used to be familiar. The dumper isn't asking, "Is this person right for me?" They're asking, "Is this better than what I had?" This is where emotional distance starts to operate differently. The dumper might seem engaged, they might seem interested, but there's a detachment underneath, something that doesn't quite settle. They're testing possibilities, not committing to them. Short-term relationships function as emotional measuring tools. They reveal what the dumper thought they wanted versus what actually feels right. And most of the time, those two things don't align. The freedom they crave doesn't feel as expansive as they imagined. The new person doesn't fill the space the way they thought someone would. What happens next depends entirely on what the dumper sees when they look back. Not at the relationship itself, but at the person they left. If that person is still visibly waiting, still emotionally frozen, still oriented entirely around the breakup, the dumper stays away. The psychological dynamics remain imbalanced. But if the ex has moved, if they've rebuilt, if they've created a life that doesn't revolve around being left, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but the narrative the dumper built starts to crack. Because the one thing they didn't expect was for the ex to be okay. And when someone is okay, when they've stopped chasing, stopped pleading, stopped performing emotional collapse, the dumper's assumptions stop working. Silence, real silence, becomes a new piece of evidence. And unlike begging, silence doesn't confirm the breakup. It complicates it. The dumper expected certain behaviors. They expected sadness. They expected repeated attempts at contact. They expected the ex to remain emotionally visible, either through direct messages or indirect signals. Stories aimed at them. Posts designed to provoke a reaction. Mutual friends reporting back on how badly things are going. These reactions are predictable. They fit the script. They allow the dumper to maintain the psychological narrative they've constructed. I left, and they couldn't handle it. I made the right choice. But when none of that happens, when the ex goes quiet, not cold, not hostile, just quiet, the script breaks. The dumper notices. At first, they might interpret the silence as anger, then as indifference, then, eventually, as something they didn't anticipate, actual movement. The ex is no longer performing grief. They're no longer centered on the breakup. And that absence of expected behavior creates a strange kind of cognitive dissonance. The dumper thought they knew how this would unfold. Silence rewrites the story. This is not about playing games. It's not about withholding contact to manipulate a reaction. It's about something much simpler. The psychological impact of seeing someone function without you. When the ex stops reaching out, stops trying to fix what's broken, stops asking for explanations, they stop being the person the dumper left. They become someone the dumper doesn't recognize anymore. And that unfamiliarity creates a pull that desperation never could. Emotional withdrawal, when it's genuine, shifts the power dynamic entirely. The dumper begins to wonder. Not loudly, not urgently, but the question starts forming. Are they actually okay without me? And once that question exists, the dumper starts looking for answers. They start checking. Not directly, but quietly, through the only window they still have access to. Social media becomes the primary surveillance tool. The dumper doesn't reach out. They don't ask mutual friends. They don't send a text. They watch. They scroll through stories. They check posts. They notice who's in the photos, where the ex is going, whether they seem happy, whether they seem different. This isn't obsessive behavior. It's investigative behavior. The dumper is gathering behavioral evidence from a distance, trying to reconstruct a picture of the person they left without actually engaging with them. An active life becomes threatening in a way the dumper didn't expect. New people, new settings, nights out, mornings that look put together. The ex isn't broadcasting heartbreak anymore. They're broadcasting something else. Continuation. And that continuation disrupts the dumper's psychological framework. They didn't imagine this version of events. They imagined sadness, maybe some struggle, maybe some visible longing. What they're seeing instead is someone who seems to be building something without them. And that image doesn't fit the narrative they've been using to justify the breakup. This is not immediate jealousy, it's narrative disruption. The dumper starts asking questions they didn't think they'd need to ask. Did they move on that quickly? Was I easier to replace than I thought? Did I matter as much as I believed I did? These questions don't feel good. They don't create clarity. They create doubt. And doubt, when it shows up late, after the breakup has already been executed, starts to eat away at the original decision. The dumper begins to second-guess, not whether they should go back, but whether they understood the relationship correctly in the first place. What they're seeing now doesn't match what they expected to see. And when expectations fracture, behavior changes. The dumper doesn't make a dramatic return, but they start testing the waters in small, almost invisible ways. They start trying to re-enter the emotional orbit they thought they'd left behind for good. Reevaluation doesn't happen all at once. It's not a sudden realization. It's a slow accumulation of quiet moments where the original certainty starts to feel less solid. The dumper revisits the reasons they left, not obsessively, but periodically, in the gaps between distractions. They start comparing what they have now to what they had before. And the comparison doesn't always favor the present. The freedom they chased feels emptier than anticipated. The new connections don't create the emotional depth they expected. The life they thought they wanted starts to feel more like a placeholder than a destination. A silent internal question begins to form, something the dumper didn't think they'd be asking weeks or months after walking away. Did this actually fix what I was feeling? The answer isn't immediate. The dumper doesn't want to admit doubt. Admitting doubt feels like failure, like weakness, like proof that they didn't know themselves as well as they believed. So the question sits there, unresolved, while the dumper continues moving through their new routines, testing possibilities, watching the ex from a distance, trying to determine whether what they're feeling now is just adjustment or something closer to regret. This is where relationship psychology becomes less about the relationship and more about the internal process of the person who left. The breakup was supposed to bring clarity. It was supposed to resolve the discomfort they felt while they were still in it. But clarity doesn't arrive on command. And sometimes the discomfort doesn't disappear. It just changes locations. What was once tension between two people becomes tension inside one person. The dumper starts to realize that leaving didn't solve the problem. It just removed the other person from the equation. And without that person, the solution they were looking for starts to feel incomplete. The original decision, the one that felt so necessary, so final, begins to destabilize. And once that destabilization starts, the dumper's behavior begins to shift in ways that are small but unmistakable. The dumper doesn't come back loudly. They don't send a long message explaining that they've been thinking, that they've reconsidered, that maybe they made a mistake. That kind of vulnerability takes time to build, and most dumpers aren't there yet. Instead, they test proximity. They reach out in ways that feel casual, almost neutral, as if nothing significant has happened. A like on an old post, a reaction to a story, a comment that doesn't say much but says, "I'm still here, I'm still watching, I'm still aware of you." These are not accidents, they're behavioral indicators. The dumper is attempting to re-enter the emotional orbit they once left, but they're doing it carefully, with plausible deniability built in. If the ex responds with enthusiasm, the dumper can move forward. If the ex ignores it, the dumper can retreat without losing face. It's a low-risk probe, designed to measure emotional availability without committing to anything real. The psychology here is straightforward. The dumper wants to know if the door is still open, but they don't want to be the one to knock. Sometimes the probes escalate. A casual message. "Hey, how have you been?" Not an apology, Not an explanation. Just a reappearance, framed as friendly curiosity. The tone is light, almost detached, but the subtext is clear. I want back in your attention. The dumper is testing whether the attachment patterns that once existed are still intact. Whether the ex will respond the way they used to. Whether the emotional distance that's formed can be collapsed with minimal effort. Most of the time, this works. Most of the time, the ex responds too quickly, too warmly, too openly. And that's when everything falls apart again. Because the dumper wasn't looking for desperation. They were looking for balance. And the moment the ex shows that the old dynamic is still active, the one where they care more, reach more, need more, the dumper pulls back. The breakup gets rejustified in real time. And the cycle repeats. The mistake happens in the response. The ex sees the dumper reaching out and interprets it as a sign. Proof that they've been missed, that the breakup wasn't final, that maybe things can be repaired. So they respond with energy, with warmth, with hope. They open up too fast, say too much, make themselves too available, and in doing so, they collapse the very thing that made the dumper curious in the first place, the distance. Excessive enthusiasm breaks equilibrium. It signals that nothing has changed. The ex is still operating from the same emotional position they were in before. Waiting, hoping, willing to accept the dumper back without conditions. And the dumper, seeing this, realizes that the dynamic they left is still there, unchanged, ready to resume. That realization doesn't pull them closer. It pushes them away. The psychological safety that comes from knowing someone has moved on, that they're no longer desperate, disappears. And with it, the dumper's curiosity disappears too. This is where most reconciliations fail before they even begin. The ex mistakes the dumper's return for regret, when in reality, it's just a test. A test to see if the power dynamic has shifted, if the emotional behavior has evolved, if the relationship patterns that caused the breakup have been disrupted. When the test reveals that nothing has changed, the dumper retreats. Not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a quiet confirmation. This is still the same. I was right to leave. And just like that, the door that briefly opened closes again. The cycle doesn't repeat because the dumper is cruel. It repeats because the abandoned partner, in their relief at being contacted, forgets that behavior is the only language that matters now. Words don't rebuild trust, patterns do. And the pattern the dumper is looking for is one where the ex no longer needs them the way they used to. Where the ex has built something independent, something whole, something that doesn't collapse the moment contact is re-established. Until that pattern appears, the dumper won't stay. They'll just keep testing, retreating, and moving further away each time. It's easy to view the dumper as cold, as heartless, as someone who walked away without consequences, who moved on effortlessly while the other person suffered. But that narrative, while emotionally satisfying, is psychologically incomplete. The dumper is not untouched. They're not operating from a place of cruelty or indifference. They're operating from confusion, guilt, and often their own unresolved attachment patterns that they're only beginning to recognize after the relationship ends. New relationships, when they happen, are not evidence of emotional replacement. They're often forms of external validation, attempts to prove to themselves that they made the right decision, that there's something better out there, that the discomfort they felt in the previous relationship was situational, not internal. But external validation doesn't resolve internal questions. It just delays them. And eventually, the dumper is forced to sit with the same emotional behavior they were trying to escape. The difference is, now they're sitting with it alone. The dumper is also trying to reorganize internally. They're processing the breakup in reverse. While the ex is grieving the loss, the dumper is questioning whether the loss was necessary. While the ex is trying to understand what went wrong, the dumper is trying to understand whether they were running from the relationship or from something inside themselves. This process doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen visibly, but it happens. And when it does, the dumper's perception of the breakup and of the person they left begins to shift in ways they didn't anticipate. What looks like coldness from the outside is often just emotional withdrawal while they try to make sense of a decision that felt clear in the moment, but feels increasingly complicated in hindsight. The dumper is not a villain. They're just a person navigating relationship dynamics they don't fully understand, making choices that feel right until they don't, and living with the psychological consequences of having walked away from something they're not entirely sure they were supposed to leave. A breakup does not immediately end the emotional bond. It restructures it. It takes what was visible and active and pushes it underground, where it continues operating in silence. Both people carry the relationship forward, not as a shared experience anymore, but as an internal reference point. The dumper measures new connections against what they left. The ex measures their recovery against how much they're still thinking about what's gone. And both of them, in different ways, are asking the same question. Was this the right decision? The breakup initiates an internal process that doesn't follow a clean timeline. It doesn't resolve itself in weeks. It unfolds in stages. And those stages don't sync up between the two people. While one is grieving, the other is testing freedom. While one is rebuilding, the other is questioning. And by the time the dumper starts reconsidering, the ex has often already moved past the point where reconciliation makes sense. The window opens and closes based on behavior, not words. And most people miss it because they're reacting instead of observing. What this case reveals is that the person who maintains emotional control, not coldness, not detachment, but control, influences the outcome more than the person who left. The dumper's feelings are not fixed. They shift based on what they observe, what they experience, and what they see in the person they walked away from. Desperation confirms the breakup. Silence complicates it. Independence disrupts the narrative entirely. And when the narrative breaks, the dumper starts questioning not just the breakup, but everything they believed about why it had to happen. Time exposes unresolved decisions. It doesn't heal them. It just reveals whether they were made from clarity or from fear. And most of the time, the dumper realizes too late that what they were running from wasn't the relationship. It was themselves. By then, the ex has already stopped waiting. And that's when the real consequence of the breakup finally arrives. Not for the person who was left, but for the person who chose to leave. The dumper's mind is not a mystery. It's a process. One that unfolds in predictable stages, driven by psychological dynamics that most people never observe, because they're too focused on their own pain to notice the patterns forming on the other side. What this reveals is simple. Leaving someone doesn't resolve internal conflict. It just relocates it. And eventually, that conflict surfaces again, quieter this time, but no less real. The person who left will question their decision. Not immediately, not obviously, but they will. And when they do, the only thing that will matter is what they see when they look back. Not what was said during the breakup, not the history of the relationship, just the behavior of the person they left behind. Whether that person stayed frozen, waiting for their return, or whether they moved, rebuilt, and created something that no longer revolved around being abandoned. Most people get this wrong. They think visibility keeps them relevant. They think emotional availability invites reconciliation. But the dumper doesn't return to desperation. They return to balance. To someone who no longer needs them the way they once did. To someone whose life continued without them. And if that version of the person never appears, the dumper stays away. Not because they don't care, but because the dynamic that caused the breakup is still active, and going back would mean stepping into the same emotional behavior that made them want to leave in the first place. This isn't about winning someone back. It's about understanding what actually shifts relationship dynamics after a breakup, and what shifts them is not love, not history, not shared memories. It's the absence of the patterns that made the relationship unsustainable. When those patterns remain, so does the distance. When they break, the dumper notices. They don't always act on it, but they notice. If you want to keep learning about relationship psychology, attachment patterns, and the behavioral dynamics that govern how people connect and disconnect, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This kind of analysis doesn't show up in surface-level advice. It requires a deeper look at how emotional behavior actually functions, beyond what people say, and into what they do.